What is a dinosaur who's also a dictator called? Uh, Tyrannosaurus. Oh man. Why do so many tyrants try to seize power? Because when they heard, what is the meaning of life? They didn't think it was a question. Oh man. A tyrant is like bad weather. The rain never ends. Okay, seventh grade or sixth grade. Um, why am I making tyrant jokes? Well, in addition to the fact that they're really funny, I'm also making them because today we're going to be learning about Athens and Sparta and why each is important and what kind of governments existed in them. Right? And one of those governments, of course, is a government called Tyranny. So Athens and Sparta are probably Greece's two most well-known city-states to history. We are going to be studying them from the period of 950 BCE to 461 BCE. So that 500-year stretch is when we're going to be covering them. So let's start with Athens. And why we care about Athens. So the main reason we care about Athens is because this has been called the birthplace of democracy. So ideas of citizens having rights and having the ability and responsibility to participate in government through voting. This is found in Athens. Sparta, on the other hand, we care about for more historical reasons. Sparta didn't have as big of an influence on the development of our society, but Sparta was a very successful city-state in ancient Greece. In fact, at one point, it was the city-state that almost took over Greece for itself, despite all the odds. It didn't do this, but it got the closest. So we care about Sparta because it provides a really good contrast to how Athens worked. All right. So, as we know from the last chapter, we know that in the beginning, Athens was ruled by kings. And kingdoms in Athens lasted until around the year 1000 BCE. And then for the next 500 years or so, Athens was then ruled by aristocrats. It had a form of government called oligarchy. An oligarchy, as you read in the book, is a form of government in which a small number of wealthy citizens rule over the city-state, or rule over the kingdom, or rule over whatever society it is. In the year 594 BCE, one aristocrat named Solon abolished the practice of serfdom and changed the laws of Athens, changed its constitution so that every male citizen, as long as you own property, is able to participate in government by voting. And this is what we're going to call democracy. So quickly, what do I mean when I say that Solon abolished serfdom? Well, it used to be the case that if you were a very poor citizen of Athens, if you owed money, then you were probably what was called a serf. That meant you were legally obligated to serve the person you owed money to. Unless you could pay them back right away, you had to work for that person like a slave, right? And the work you did would pay off your debt. Right? So before Solon, life for the poor in Athens was not good because all the laws were stacked against them and they benefited the wealthy. So Solon changed all of that. But when Solon arrived and then he died, Athens didn't immediately become a democracy. It actually existed as a tyranny for a few decades. So a tyranny is a form of government in which one person is in charge and rules over everything. Now, sometimes tyrannies are bad if that one person is greedy or selfish or dumb or makes bad decisions. But sometimes tyranny could be good, right? So if your tyrant is smart and isn't selfish and makes decisions that are good for the entire city state, then your city state is going to benefit by having a tyrant. So having a tyrant is kind of a mixed bag, right? On the one hand, you don't have any rights and responsibilities as a citizen because you don't have any power. The tyrant has all the power. But on the other hand, if the tyrant is actually really good at ruling the city state and rules fairly and does a good job protecting the city state and making it thrive, then having a tyrant is not necessarily the worst thing in the world. All right. So after Solon, they have a few decades of tyrants. Some are good, some are bad. And then in the year 506 BCE, Athens finally becomes what we think of when we think of Athens, which is a democracy. Okay. And why did Athens give way to democracy? Well, historians think this is probably because Greek city-states in general were pretty well prepared to have democracies. And this is because in the polis, in the city-state, it was common for citizens to be able to create laws. So under the oligarchy, it was the wealthy citizens that were creating the laws. Right? Under a tyranny, sometimes citizens could create laws, but it was usually the tyrant that would do it. But a lot of the Greek city-states were used to having at least some citizens being able to create some laws. And if citizens can create laws, then this automatically gives citizens a voice in their government. So as a democracy, government happens out in the open. So government decisions and discussions and debates would be held by government officials in a public place called a public forum. Right? And we know from the Greek city-states that this public forum is going to be up in the Acropolis. It's going to be in the public buildings, the top of the Acropolis, the height of the city-state, right? Because it has a special place of importance. And any Greek citizen could come and listen to a debate in a public forum, right? So all citizens could know what's going on in their government. Now, it is important to mention that some city-states were not truly democracies because only wealthy citizens really had any power in these democracies. Even in Athens, where the poor had the most rights, really the people who were making most of the decisions, the people who had the most influence in the government were the wealthy, not the poor. And of course, only men. And you had to be a citizen, right? You couldn't be a foreigner or a metic. You definitely couldn't be a woman. So sorry, ladies. All right, let's move on to Sparta. So we're going to contrast what we just talked about with Athens with Sparta. So Sparta, in the beginning, was a very wealthy city-state. For about 400 years or so, it's pretty wealthy. And then around the year 600 BCE, Sparta starts to become more militaristic. Right? It starts to develop into a city-state known for producing soldiers. And we learned why this was in the last chapter, why Sparta had to focus on soldiering and on warfare in order to acquire resources. Right? So for a long time, Sparta knew that it had the biggest, baddest military. And it was so confident in its military that it didn't even bother to build walls to protect its city-states. It was like, nobody's going to dare attack us because we've got soldiers everywhere. So basically, by not building a wall, the Spartans were basically daring the other city-states and daring invaders to try to come and get them and see what would happen. The Spartans did not have a democracy. Instead, they had something called an oligarchy, which we learned about previously. Now, in the Spartan oligarchy, the small group of aristocrats that ruled over the city-state were not just random wealthy citizens that had acquired power. Instead, the Spartan oligarchy was contained within two different wealthy families. So there were two families that were wealthy that kind of ruled over everything as an oligarchy. And each family actually had a patriarch, a male leader, who kind of functioned like uh, a king. So even though Sparta had an oligarchy, each lead family had a leader, and the citizens of Sparta saw this leader as a king. So it was kind of like Sparta had two kings at the same time. Um, Now, the way the families ruled their government was very different than Athens. In Athens, everything is done out in the public, in a public forum, in a democracy. In Sparta, the way the families ruled was secretly. Right? They didn't do things in public. They didn't have an open forum. Right? Um, so I lost my place. Hold on. Oh, okay, yeah. The families themselves didn't have absolute power, though. There was another group of Spartans called the Council of Elders and a General Assembly of Citizens. These are two groups that kind of had some control over what this oligarchy did, right? So the oligarchy had probably like 90% of the power, but the Council of Elders, the General Assembly of Citizens, and another group called the Board of Ephors also had maybe 10% of the power. Right? So the Board of Ephors was a group of 5 men who were elected each year, and they were put in charge of a specific part of the government. Right? So the Ephors are going to be really, really important in Sparta. So yeah, unlike Athens, the Spartan government, Spartan society did not like change. Now I want you to compare something really quick. Look at this structure from modern day. This is Athens. And look at this structure. This is modern day Sparta. If you look at these two, you can see one form of architecture has survived the test of time and one has not. So what would that tell you about what each city-state thought about the importance of architecture? Well, it would tell you that for the Athenians, they cared deeply about their architecture. They wanted to construct things that would last a long time. The Spartans didn't care about any of that stuff, right? The Spartans cared about doing things their way. They didn't care how long their structures lasted. If a building fell over, they would just build a new one. Okay, we'll stop there. And in the next video, I'll talk about how Greece's politics changed.